Dr. 𝗙𝗵𝗶 Our keynote speaker today, Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge, Chief Economist for South Asia at the World Bank, members of the Governing Board and the Monetary Policy Board, Deputy Governor, Mr. 𝗀𝗶𝗿𝗁, Assistant Governors, members of the senior management and the fellow colleagues from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, distinguished members of the academia, members of the diplomatic community, financial research community, and the movers and shakers of today's proceedings, the research presenters and discussants, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to you all. Welcome to the 13th Annual International Research Conference hosted by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. It is both a pleasure and privilege to inaugurate this important event today, especially as we come together once again after a 5-year hiatus since the 12th International Research Conference held in 2019. Over these past years, the world has undergone profound transformations that have fundamentally reshaped the global economic landscape, making this gathering even more timely and important. The global economy continues to be influenced by a complex interplay of forces: shifting trade dynamics, geopolitics, artificial intelligence, geoeconomic fragmentation, and climate change. These are further compounded by structural issues within the national economies. Hence, it is crucial for policymakers to remain foresighted and proactive. Today's conference serves as an excellent platform for fostering such critical dialogue by bringing together researchers and policymakers to chart a path forward to navigate these complexities. In an effort to make this event as green and environmentally friendly as possible, all of today's proceedings are conveniently accessible via the QR code displayed on the screen. It will be displayed shortly. We encourage you to explore the material available there to prepare for what promises to be an eventful day. On that note, to formally commence proceedings of today, I invite Dr. 𝗀𝗫𝗍𝗍, Director of Economic Research of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, to present the welcome address.
Governor, Dr. 𝗙𝗵𝗶, the Chief Economist for World Bank South Asia region, Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge, members of the Monetary Policy Board, Deputy Governor, Assistant Governors of the Central Bank, the stars of today's event, the researchers and discussants, distinguished guests, colleagues of the Central Bank, and ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all to the 13th International Conference of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We are pleased to organize this conference for the first time after 5 years, as COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis in Sri Lanka diverted our focus on tackling pressing economic concerns. With the revival of macroeconomic stability in the country to a greater extent, we are now able to resume our business as usual. In this regard, we managed to publish 2 new volumes of our flagship research publication named Staff Studies this year. The latest volume was published today along with this conference, resuming our tradition. As we gather here today, we are reminded of vital role research plays in shaping robust and sustainable macroeconomic policies. The current global economic environment, characterized by uneven economic recoveries, geopolitical tensions, shifting trade dynamics, climate change challenges, and evolving technological landscapes, highlights the complexities of risk and uncertainties we face. These persistent challenges demand innovative thinking, evidence-based policy solutions, and collaborative efforts with broader stakeholders to explore new tools and strategies for economic resilience. This conference serves as an ideal platform to exchange ideas, share experiences, and inspire collaboration. It seeks to stimulate innovative theoretical and empirical research on contemporary macroeconomic issues. As a central bank committed to maintaining domestic price stability and financial system stability, thereby fostering growth, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka recognizes the immense value of bridging the gap between theory and practice. Today's deliberations promise to enrich our understanding and contribute significantly to policy discourse both at national and international levels. For this research conference, we received over 85 abstracts from local and international researchers, and after shortlisting, we accepted 31 research papers to be evaluated. The 8 papers that will be presented today were selected based on double-blinded review by an eminent external reviewer panel. Before concluding, I would like to once again extend a warm welcome to all of you. Your presence here underscores the importance of this dialogue and reinforces our shared commitment to advancing economic research to the betterment of the society. Let us seize this opportunity to engage a meaningful discussion, challenge our perspectives, and build connections that extend beyond this gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, have a pleasant day ahead, and I wish you all a fruitful and intellectually stimulating conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. 𝗙𝗵𝗹, for that warm welcome. The International Research Conference of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka steps into its 13th year under the guidance of Governor Dr. 𝗙𝗵𝗶 as one of the flagship events of the economic research community. This year, the conference attracted high-quality papers from across the globe with theoretical and empirical rigor and relevance, which were carefully reviewed by a distinguished external review panel appointed by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka before selection. Now, I cordially invite the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. 𝗙𝗵𝗶, to deliver the inaugural address.
Good morning, keynote speaker Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge, members of the Monetary Policy Board and the Governing Board, Deputy Governor, Assistant Governors, Heads of Department, researchers, discussants, and invitees for this conference, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me congratulate the Economic Research Department for resuming having this international research conference after some years because of the COVID and other issues that we were facing in the last several years. Now it's getting back to a normal calendar of the conference is obviously is a welcome step. Again, let me warmly welcome all of you, those who are here to our 13th International Conference. Through this International Research Conference, the Central Bank aims to foster a research culture that is imperative for implementation of theoretically sound and evidence-based macroeconomic policies. That's important for any policymakers. Further, this international conference builds linkages with the overseas researchers to enrich our research experience. Thank you very much for researchers who are coming here all the way to participate in this conference. We are hosting this conference, as I said earlier, after a period of unprecedented challenges, both domestically and globally. The world is emerging from the global health hazard that we had as a pandemic, yet most economists continue to grapple with the scarring effects of the pandemic and also heighten geopolitical uncertainties. Moreover, the emerging threats of geoeconomic fragmentation could strain economic prospects. Challenges faced by Sri Lanka are much more profound as we are gradually emerging from dual shocks, the pandemic and the sovereign debt crisis. We are right now at the end of this debt recycling process. In this challenging economic environment, the role of the central bank and the way the central banks operate need to evolve in order to stay agile within this shifting macroeconomic landscape. In this context, let me discuss about a few global challenges that are testing the resilience and relevance of central banks' frameworks. First, most countries witness a surge in inflation in the aftermath of the pandemic. However, by now, inflation has now been reined into a great extent globally through appropriate monetary policy measures and improvements in supply conditions. The world experienced a soft landing. Earlier, there was a fear of hard landing. That was what we feared earlier. Traditionally, inflation has been viewed as a monetary phenomenon, but in recent periods, supply side shocks tend to have more frequent and intense effects on inflation. In this situation, central banks can no longer look through the supply side shocks, since supply shocks more often have second round price effects and adverse effects on inflation expectations, especially when inflation is high. Forecasting inflation and formulating monetary policy is a difficult task even in normal times. Recurring supply shocks and global uncertainties make it even more difficult, especially when there are non-linear effects. Supply shocks emanating from geopolitical tensions and climate change vulnerabilities and are becoming more frequent, warranting central banks to integrate such risk into their macroeconomic modeling and policy formulation. Hence, capturing economic dynamics and risk require a novel approach in all aspects of macroeconomic decision making. This includes exploring non-traditional data, innovate ways of data analysis and diagnostic and policy communications, and usage of new instruments and technology. Another issue we are facing now is the economic fragmentation. Many countries, particularly developing and emerging market countries, have benefited from globalization. However, globalization has slowed and reversed in the recent years, even before the geopolitical tensions caused by the Russian-Ukraine war and Israel-Hamas conflicts. These geopolitical tensions are driving the world economy from the efficient globalized trade model to a model characterized by trade blocs consisting of few countries, increased trade restrictions, and we say in terms of high tariffs on trade, and non-tariff trade barriers. A less integrated global economy is more prone to economic shocks and is exposed to higher inflationary pressures, posing challenges to central banks in maintaining price and economic stability. So there are uncertainties even the global inflation threat of slowing down the disinflation as a result of high tariffs across the borders. We'll hear more on this from our keynote speaker, who researched deeply on this challenge. I think I'm waiting to hear your thoughts in these areas. Thirdly, the climate change is a reality that we cannot ignore any further in relation to price stability and financial system stability. That's two key objectives of the central bank or in most central banks. Given that the climate change induced natural disasters are becoming more frequent and severe, with direct bearing on the macroeconomic and financial stability, it is not surprising that central banks are called on to address climate change issues, although central banks may not have sustainability mandate. Central banks are expected to contribute to the climate change mitigation efforts by internalizing climate change risk in monetary policy formulation and financial sector supervision and regulation. Modern day technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, cloud computing, IT-based supervision are currently driving the innovations globally. The role of central banks becomes more multifaceted and critical amidst these technological advances. Today, central banks have little or no choice but to leverage on these technologies to build new capacities and re-engineer their operations and work procedures. Central banks have to adapt their operations to the dynamic demands of the stakeholders to ensure convenience, speed, and affordability. Simultaneously, central banks are compelled to broaden and deepen their regulation and supervision role to deal with novel products and new service providers that operate beyond the scope of traditional financial sector, for example, like cryptocurrencies and other form of cross-border flows. Central banks have the challenge of shaping their rules, regulations, and standards in a manner that will not restrain innovations but foster the technology adoption to promote cooperation, competition, and interoperability. I'm happy to see that a sizable portion of today's conference agenda is allocated to such cutting-edge research projects. Thank you very much for the contributions. In this challenging background, we recognize that research is an integral part of central banking, as it is a critical element in the analytical apparatus that shapes central banks' decisions and policy directives. Research could provide invaluable insights for the central banks to move beyond the traditional boundaries to address complex and dynamic challenges such as geopolitical uncertainties, climate change, economic defragmentation, and technological advancements. Therefore, this International Research Conference, organized by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, forms a platform to showcase such research work and forge relationships with the international research community, both in academia and policy arena, to share their research and insights and experience. I believe this conference will spark discussions and debates pertinent to central banks so that we can learn from each other on global experiences, innovate policy tools, and novel research methodologies. I take this opportunity to congratulate the researchers who will be presenting their research at today's conference. I wish you a very productive conference with interesting discussions and exchange of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor, for your valuable remarks. It has helped set stage for today's proceedings and provided a lot of food for thought. Today, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is pleased to host Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge as the keynote speaker. Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge is a chief economist for South Asia at the World Bank, where she leads the research program on key economic issues in the region to inform policy discussions and World Bank lending decisions. Prior to this role, she served as the manager at the Development Economics Vice Presidency, where she led the flagship Global Economic Prospects report. Before joining the World Bank, Dr. Ohnsorge worked in the office of the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and at the International Monetary Fund. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals and policy publications covering a wide range of topics in international macroeconomics and finance, including debt and financial crisis, inflation and monetary policy, as well as growth and informal labor markets. Her work has been widely cited in prominent outlets such as The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and The Financial Times. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto. With this brief introduction, it is my great honor to invite Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge to deliver the keynote address of the 13th Annual International Research Conference on the topic, Implications of Geoeconomic Fragmentation for South Asia and Industrial Policy.
Thank you, Dr. 𝗀𝗍𝗃, Governor, Dr. 𝗙𝗲𝗃. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I'm truly honored to be here at this resumption of a very important tradition. So I'm glad to see that this is beginning to, hopefully, the first of many years to come. Thank you very much. And Governor, thank you also for pointing to geoeconomic fragmentation. That is what I will focus my remarks on. I'll go through three questions. I structure my remarks over the next 20 minutes or so along three questions. First, the growth outlook, just to set the stage. Second, so the bottom line of that will be basically, we need growth, we need more growth. The whole world needs more growth, but Sri Lanka also needs faster growth. And one area where there is actually a lot of untapped potential is in the area of trade and investment. When we point to trade, the people's first reaction is, but why trade now, when the whole world is geoeconomically fragmenting? And that's what I will go to in my third question. So let's start with the first, just setting the stage. So you know Sri Lanka better than I do, but let me just put it into international context. So South Asia is the fastest growing region in the world. It is truly the bright spot in the global economy, but of course I'm sure you have felt this as well. It's because of India. So you see here the growth rates in the chart in the center. It's India that's driving this high growth. But it's not just India in one sense, in the sense that the region has surprised on the upside over the ever since these recessions, especially in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Both countries have actually surprised on the upside. They've recovered faster from these crises than anyone had anticipated. So at this point, even the non-Indian South Asian countries are have caught up to other emerging markets and developing economies. But that growth rate is not enough to meet even the government's own goals. So here in the chart, all the governments in South Asia, including Sri Lanka, there's only one exception, which is Pakistan. All the governments in South Asia have announced a goal, an official goal, that they want to reach a higher level of per capita incomes, a higher category per capita incomes. So you can see the actual growth rates that are projected now for all of these countries in the blue bars, and the golden diamonds show you the kind of growth rates that would be needed to achieve these statuses that have been announced as a goal, an official goal. All countries need somewhere between 1 and 8 percentage point faster growth. The region needs to grow faster. That's the bottom line. Growth is not enough. Also, the region has considerable risks. So, Governor, you mentioned climate risks. You also mentioned fiscal risks. I here want to focus on the fiscal risk. Government debt in particular. Some of the data are easier to get than other data, but here's our best summary of government debt, latest data, 2024. And you see that the region holds a sorry record. A lot of countries, more than half the countries, are in the top quartile by government debt. So you'll see this kind of chart a lot through the rest of my 15 minutes or so. The red shade is always the interquartile range of emerging markets and developing economies, and then the bars are each of our countries. You can see that all the bars are above the red shade, i.e. they're in the top quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. Some of the highest government debt levels. Now, people have come up with all sorts of clever ways of reducing debt, and we have summarized these in a recent paper with Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff. But really, the only lasting way of reducing debt, I'm happy to go into all the various other clever ways, but really the only true way of reducing debt is to outgrow it. And the beauty of South Asia is that there is actually a reservoir of potential that could be tapped, and it's currently untapped. Actually, in our recent reports, we've highlighted a couple of reservoirs, but I will just focus on one, which takes me to openness to global trade and investment. So you may ask why focus on trade now in South Asia? And the reason is, the why is because South Asia lags so far behind everyone else. There is such a catch-up potential. Then you may ask why now? And the reason is that there is currently this window of opportunity. It's just now, it won't be there 5 years from now. It's now that it has to be seized. But let me first, in that second question, go to the why. Why in South Asia? And in what sense does South Asia lag so far behind? I'm sure you know these numbers for Sri Lanka, and I want to show you that it's also true for your neighbors. These are trade to GDP ratios. Again, the shade is the interquartile range for all emerging markets in red, and in gray for small states. Small states are always much more volatile. They're much more diverse, so it's always a little bit of a different story. But almost all countries in South Asia are in the bottom quartile by trade openness. How can that be? They're in the bottom quartile by trade openness. That's not a recent phenomenon. It's been like this forever. And there used to be this exception on tourism, especially Sri Lanka, in Bhutan as well, India. But it's no longer the exception. The rebound from the pandemic has been, in the tourism sector, seems to have been much slower in South Asia than anywhere else. So at this point, even the tourism exports are in the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. It is such a missed opportunity. So that's on the trade side, this lack of openness. But it's also on the finance side, this lack of openness. FDI, again, chart on the left, net FDI inflows are the lowest in the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. Only India is at the threshold, and even India is less than half of the emerging market average. Not many, I mean, the portfolio investment inflows are a bit different because there's a large range. A few countries get a lot of inflows, and many countries get hardly any inflows or outflows. So there, South Asia is kind of somewhere in the middle. Sri Lanka is a bit on the outflow side. The only sense in which the region is really open is in remittances. So there, some countries are in the top quartile, Nepal in particular, others are near the top quartile, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are above the average. That carries its own problems, but that's a separate topic. Happy to go into it if there's interest. So some of that trade openness may just be bad luck. It's just geography that parts of South Asia are not on the big trading routes between China and Europe or China and the US, and that's just the lack of geography. But it's not just bad luck. It's also policy, deliberate policy action. That's the point of the chart on the left. Actually, both charts. The chart on the left shows the average tariffs in South Asia, and then again in the interquartile range. And you can see that 3 countries are in the top quartile by tariffs. 3 South Asian countries have some of the highest tariffs in the world. And Pakistan looks good, and Sri Lanka looks even better, until you start taking into account the para-tariffs. So once you have the golden diamonds, here the para-tariffs, it is far above the average. It's really some of the most tariffed countries in the world. So that's on the trade side, but there's something similar is happening on the FDI side. It's very difficult to get comparable cross-country data on FDI restrictions. So the best measure is probably the OECD measure, but that has only India in it in South Asia. So we can't use that. I mean, we have used that, but not for this audience. So the next best that we could find with cross-country coverage is this EIU measure that measures a little bit more than FDI, but it gives a sense of what drives investors, what investors are interested in, which is trade and foreign currency restrictions. So that it's a kind of restriction that prevents foreign direct investors from repatriating their earnings, for example. GVC participants from repatriating their export earnings too. And you can see again, most South Asian countries are in the bottom quartile by openness to trade and foreign exchange transactions. India is somewhere on the lower, not quite in the bottom quartile, but it's near the bottom threshold. It's just, the region's just very, very close to, by EMDE standards, by emerging market standards, to both trade and investment. And it also stands out, it was another sorry record, which is that it doesn't give any special treatment to its neighbors, or very little special treatment to its neighbors. So here in both of these charts, on the left and in the center, we've looked at the bilateral tariffs and other non-tariff trade costs for each of these, the best known regional trade agreements. So you have Mercosur, you have ECOWAS, you have CARICOM, you have COMESA, you've got NAFTA even, and the EU, of course. The EU is kind of different. There's much more than a trade agreement. And then you have SAARC. Now, I know you feel there's much more than, we can see it in the numbers, but I just want to give you the numbers. And it's remarkable how little the gap is, how small the gap is in SAARC between the restrictions imposed within the region and with the rest of the world. And so the golden diamonds are always how each SAARC country treats the rest of the world, the bilateral tariffs with the rest of the world, or the bilateral non-tariff barriers with the rest of the world. And then the bars are for within region. And really, there's not much of a difference, or much less of a difference than in other regional agreements. And other regional agreements have also been criticized. There's been a lot of complaints about Mercosur not working so well. But it's not the trade barriers, the policies that restrict it so much. Whereas in SAARC, it's really the policies that are not favorable to its neighbors. Not just not favorable, also getting less favorable over time. And that's the point of the chart on the right. It shows you the trade costs in South Asia, the non-tariff barriers. It shows you tariff barriers as well, the tariffs at the bottom, but they're so low that you can't see a trend. Not much happening there. But the non-tariff barriers within the region are rising. Whereas outside the region, they're at least flat, but within the region are rising. So the region is not helping its own integration. Now, mind you, even if it did, within region trade investment tends to be small in all regions. And that's the point of these two charts, both on exports and FDI. In red, you see the share, the part of trade to the GDP or export to the GDP and FDI to the GDP that is within region, and then in blue you see what's outside the region. Now in all region, within region transactions, whether it's on the trade side or on the investment side, tend to be the smaller part of trade. But in South Asia, really low. I mean, you can't even see the red line on FDI. It's so small. There are, of course, some exceptions. Like, I believe we have someone here from the Central Bank of Nepal. I know you're well familiar with the FDI from India now into Nepal. So there it's a large part, but really in aggregate for the region as a whole, it's tiny, it's tiny. But it's only one part of the closeness. Really, this is much bigger than a lack of intra-regional trade. This is FDI. It's a lack of trade and FDI openness. It's much bigger than just about within region. Which is a pity. And that takes me to the third question, which is a pity because now is the moment when countries, when investors are trying to rearrange their global supply chains, diversify. Now is the time of China +1, right? This is the moment where people are looking for different locations. This is the moment when countries that are open can find a receptive audience. And you will have heard about these connector countries. No, a lot has been the news about Mexico and Vietnam. Two classic connector countries that are mentioned in the literature. So especially Mexico has received a lot of attention in the geoeconomic fragmentation literature. No, it's 𝗙𝗲𝗃 and 𝗀𝗏 2023 that has especially mentioned Mexico. And they looked at individual 6-digit industries and showed that Chinese FDI is coming in, whereas Mexican exports are going out to the US. So there's a sense of this vertical integration. You have the FDI coming from China into Mexico, and then you have the exports going out from Mexico into the US. And that's what a lot of the political angst is about. Turns out that this may be true in 6-digit industries, but it's actually a drop in the ocean. So Mexico in aggregate, at least with the latest data, now FDI data always lags. So FDI data is 2022, export data is 23, it always lags. Who knows how this looks but as in 2023 or 24. But just to give you a sense, Mexico is actually very much a vertical connector country in the sense that it takes European FDI at scale. So these are the car manufacturers. The German car manufacturers, massive European FDI, and then converts it and ships it into exports into the US. It really is a vertical connector, as we call it. That's one model, and there's been a lot of political pressure on this. The other model is Vietnam. Very, very different. These are totally different models. Vietnam takes FDI from everyone. And it exports to everyone. It's totally open to, it's like well diversified. You can see that both in FDI liabilities and in exports. You see both, I mean, EU, US, China, they're almost the same shares in FDI, and not quite so close, but much closer in Mexico on exports too. It's truly a diversified, well diversified, horizontal connector, as we call it. And we derive two indices of connectedness, but perhaps in the chart on the right, but perhaps it's, in the interest of time, I'll move on. So, what type of connector you are really makes a difference in this current environment of geoeconomic fragmentation. Many countries are trying to become the next Mexico or the next Vietnam, and some countries, including some of your neighbors, think that geopolitical non-alignment is the important thing. Turns out it's not, because everyone is geopolitically non-aligned. So this on the chart on the left, there is a standard new index that it was common in the political science literature, is now being absorbed by the economic literature as well. So the IMF has come out with a number of papers measuring geoeconomic fragmentation by this index on the left. It basically takes UN votes and sees how many times you've agreed with the US, a country has agreed with the US, and how many times it's deviated, and collapses this whole thing into an index of geopolitical stance. It's a histogram, so it shows you the distribution of votes of countries by these geopolitical stances. Red for emerging markets, blue for advanced economies. By construction, the US is on the right. Turns out, and China, you see the line for China, it's not that they're far end, it's Iran, Zimbabwe. You can see also that the bulk of emerging markets is somewhere close to China, and the bulk of advanced economy is somewhere close to the US, but not at the US, and it's somewhere in the middle. And that's the catch, geopolitical non-alignment. All the emerging markets, that big bulk of the dashed red line, almost all of them are geopolitically non-aligned. Sri Lanka is actually, you see that in the chart on the right, so that the gray bars, again, the interquartile range, and the blue bars, each of our countries. So the ones that are in that bulk, basically, of the red bar, red line, dotted line, the left. Sri Lanka is actually closer to China, but all the others are pretty much in the bulk, in the bulge there, no? So geopolitically aligned, pretty much everyone is. The difference in South Asia that is geoeconomically non-aligned, and that's what we capture with this index of geoeconomic connectedness. It's the weighted standard deviation of bilateral ties, exports, FDI, and the weights are the geopolitical distance. So the difference between each country's stance and all its trading partners or FDI partners, FDI sources stances. So what you get is essentially a sense of diversification, but not any odd diversification, not any random diversification, but diversification in one specific sense, in geopolitical, across the geopolitical spectrum. And that index is shown in the left chart here. It shows you again the interquartile range, and it shows that most of our countries in South Asia, including Sri Lanka, are actually exceptionally geoeconomically non-aligned. So they're exceptionally diversified in their export markets across the geopolitical spectrum. Yeah, you trade with everyone. You trade with China, you trade with UAE, you trade with US, with Europe, much more than the normal emerging markets, the bulk of emerging markets and developing economies. You're in the top quartile. And that's true for exports, and that's also true for FDI sources. FDI comes from everywhere. It comes from China, it comes from the US, it comes from Europe, it comes from everywhere, much more than in the bulk of emerging markets and developing economies. So the region would be so well placed, it already has these economic ties, to take advantage of this current environment of geoeconomic fragmentation, if only it was more open. And with that, let me conclude, since my 20 minutes are up here. So first, the region is growing fast, but really growth would need to be faster, both just to achieve government goals and really to outgrow the legacy stock of debt. And one of the big untapped potentials of the region is trade. Just greater openness to global trade and global investment. And now is the time, now when everyone is looking to diversify their supply chains. This is the moment where you really want to be Vietnam, you want to open up. Because you have the ties already, but you need to increase them. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ohnsorge, for those thoughts. Many timely insights, especially considering the critical juncture that Sri Lanka is in, both on the domestic front and in the global context. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the conclusion of the inaugural session of the 13th International Research Conference of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.